Good morning. I'm grateful to be here with you all this morning. I regret that I'm not able to be here in person, but I suspect by now we're all accustomed to this format of sharing. I'm grateful also to my brother and your pastor, Mark Winters, who invited me to be here and to share with you all. I met Mark when I was vice president of CTS, and Mark, one of the things that I admire about him is that he has a pastor's heart. He has the administrative gifts of a priest. But the thing that probably drew me mostly to him is that he has the voice of a prophet. And it's oftentimes that mouth, that voice of a prophet, that probably gets him into trouble, but it's the part that I find most endearing. We all need to be more prophetic in the world that we live in. The text has been read, but I want to lift up a small portion of it that I would like to focus on for the time that is mine this morning. Then Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." If you would, please pray with me for just a few moments on the subject, the best laid plans. Gracious and eternal God, I thank you that you have answered my prayers and have become my salvation. I pray that the word that I speak this morning will be your word. It will be a word of hope, a word of love, a word of liberation, a word of righteousness for your name's sake. Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. The best laid plans. Perhaps some of you will recognize that title as being a portion from a poem by Robert Burns called To a Mouse. The full line is, "The best laid plans of mice and men often go awry." The entire poem is Robert Burns speaking in the voice of a farmer who in part is apologizing to a mouse that he has destroyed his home. But then he's also offering the mouse some forgiveness because he knows that the mouse sometimes takes his food. But the most commonly quoted line, the line where I took the title from, comes from this particular stanza, and it says, "But little mouse, you are not alone, and proving foresight may be in vain. The best laid scheme or plans of mice and men go often awry, and leave us nothing but grief and pain for promised joy." You see, that particular phrase or that particular stanza in the poem is reminding us that no matter how much you plan, no matter how much you scheme, things might go wrong, even though you were planning for something else to happen. It happens to humans, it happens to creatures, it happens to something even as harmless as a mouse. Things went awry, even for Joseph. We have to see Joseph's story as part of the larger narrative. It's part of Jacob's story, Jacob or Israel as he is later understood. If we look at Jacob's entire story, we know that planning and scheming was a big part of Jacob's history. Jacob schemed to get Esau's birthright. Jacob's father-in-law schemed to get Jacob to marry Leah, even though Jacob really wanted to marry Rachel. There's a lot of scheming and planning in Jacob's story. And so here, in this part of Jacob's narrative, we come to Jacob's sons, and we see more planning and more scheming. First, we have to understand that Joseph is not the oldest. In fact, he's one of the youngest, and he's the son of Jacob's old age, as the text says. He's one of two sons born from Rachel. Rachel, who is Jacob's favorite wife. And herein comes a lot of the planning and scheming. You see, not only is there a lot of scheming in Jacob's story, but there's also a lot of patriarchy in Jacob's story. Patriarchy in the form of the oldest son inheritance, or the ways in which people fight back and forth to decide who will get what. You see, the point of this part of the story is that there's a lot of significance in the way Jacob has privileged Joseph. And it probably has to do with birth order and which wife Joseph was born to. Joseph has told dreams about him being in a superior position, and these dreams don't sit well with his brothers. They were probably already upset by the way their social world and their familial order had been disrupted by Joseph's birth. His birth that's now calling everything that they had hoped for and everything that they had planned for into question. Here it is that this dreamer is already saying that he's had dreams that are basically going to be the fulfillment of what they feared. So the brothers develop a scheme, the best laid scheme. Jacob's sons want to occupy their rightful place in his lineage. They know of the promises to Abraham. They know that the promises have come down to Jacob, and they want their descendants to inherit all that was promised. Instead of worrying about making sure that everyone has enough to go around, they're worried about making sure they, themselves, and their children have more than anybody else. They're trying to expand their own territory. And Joseph is just having innocent dreams. He's got a nice coat, apparently has the leisure time to dream. Joseph is kind of like that mouse, maybe a bit naive. But things go downhill from there. From the point of Joseph's dream and the scheming of his brothers, all of that planning goes awry. Not only is this the case in this particular story from this text, but this is the history of our world. Robert Burns' poem tells us that this is pretty much how things go in the world that we live in. Whether you are as calculating as a son steeped in a patriarchal tradition, or as clueless as a younger son who just wants to strut around in his coat that his father brought for him, planning can sometimes go wrong. The problem is that when planning happens, the ball gets rolling, and if you're not paying attention to where that ball is going, it'll end up going downhill pretty quickly. You see, I often tell my students when I teach classes is that oppression often follows the path of least resistance. It often rolls downhill. And history is littered with examples of plans going awry and things going downhill. Think about Columbus during the European age of exploration. Columbus set out to find a path to India. His ships hit the shores of North America instead. And in Europe's ambitions to explore and exploit this new world, the indigenous people paid a horrific price. The plan to conquer this new land soon went awry. It led to wars, it led to disease, it led to genocide. And even hundreds of years later, that ball still seems to be rolling. Despite what the history books tell us, colonialism and exploration was not a benevolent enterprise. It was rooted in the accumulation of wealth and the superiority of Europe, and things went downhill from there. The transatlantic slave trade was no different. At the time when Europe was beginning to think about its own superiority and creating this pattern of white supremacy the world over, this racism combined with exploitation, of which the church was complicit, led to North American chattel slavery. Christian Europeans, extracted human beings from Africa. They shipped them to the Caribbean, to South America and to North America, forced them to work, tortured, brutalized them, even made them bear children who would be born into slavery. And contrary to what other people might believe, slavery was not a necessary evil. It was an evil rooted in white supremacy and greed, and things went downhill from there. Unfortunately, this is a pattern with humanity at times. We are really unaware of how we continue to make the same mistakes that our forebears are made because we're not really paying attention to where our plans are going. In a moment when things seem perfectly fine, we're not really paying attention to just how destructive some of our ambitions might be. And this is because we've never really dealt with the root problems of racism, patriarchy, and greed. So much of our society, so much of our social order is based on hierarchy and privilege that we don't even see when it's a part of our planning. This was the case with Joseph's brothers. It wasn't that they just didn't get along. They didn't understand how their ambitions, how their planning was motivated by the root causes of patriarchy, privilege, and greed. When planning is rooted in self-enrichment and the exploitation of others, those plans will go awry. You see, we don't realize that because we want our neighborhood to be the best, sometimes that leads us to being okay with a government that privileges our roads and our infrastructure in the suburbs. Meanwhile, other areas suffer. Because we want our children to have the best education, we are often okay with educational plans where the best schools continue to get the best resources and the worst schools continue to suffer. Because we are focused on ourselves, sometimes we are okay with city planning and development that is focused on building and protecting those of us who are already well off, but neglects those who are already disadvantaged. And unfortunately, things go downhill from there. This happens with plans that are sometimes rooted, without us even knowing it, in xenophobia. We have to protect our borders. There's nothing wrong with building a wall. We have to keep what belongs to us protected. Meanwhile, plans that are rooted in xenophobia will go awry. Even those plans that are based on seeming to want the best for others can sometimes be a form of paternalism. When we think we know the best for other people because we are more educated and we are in the best position to make the right decision, sometimes we may not be able to pay attention to the fact that those right decisions are actually benefiting us while providing mere scraps for others. When planning is steeped in self, those plans go awry. When planning is shaped by existing hierarchy and ignores the persistence of racism, those plans will go awry. When planning is based on false notions of a need for security and we refuse to listen to people whose lives are expendable by a criminal justice system gone awry, we have to ask ourselves if something is wrong with our planning. And when planning is really just another form of xenophobia and paternalism, it will indeed reinforce the same hierarchies and leave those whom some might call dreamers stuck in a hole or being sent away so that they are no longer our problem. How do we combat this tendency of the best laid plans going awry? Well, what we have to begin to do is understand that those plans go awry because they are based on human ambitions and self-guided ideas. In contrast to this, the best laid plans are actually ones that are rooted in God's shalom. Let's go back into the text for a moment. Back in the text, earlier in the text, it says that the problems between Joseph and his brother were so bad that they couldn't speak peaceably to him. You know, if you just gloss over that, if you just don't pay close enough attention, you may think it's that they just couldn't get along or they just couldn't speak nicely to each other. But that word peace is actually much deeper, and it means something more. That word peace or shalom is a much deeper concept than just getting along or not being able to talk to someone. You see, the problems between Joseph and his brothers is that they are trapped in a system of hierarchy and privilege that constantly pits them against each other, worrying about who will inherit what, worrying about whether or not their children will get a better share of the pie than someone else's children. You see, we get it wrong even today when we think that our peace would be us just getting along or being able to talk civilly to each other. The problem is not whether or not we can talk to each other. The problem is that we, just like Joseph and his brothers, continue to be trapped in systems of hierarchy and privilege that we can't see our way out of, and things keep going downhill from there. You see, God's true shalom requires a different kind of planning. It requires a planning that is not based on selfishness. It requires a planning that is not based on exploitation. It requires a planning that is not based on protecting the existing hierarchies, privileges, and the existing social order. When Joseph found himself prospering later on, when Joseph found himself prospering in Egypt, he eventually found a way to help his brothers. Instead of taking vengeance against them, he provided for them. And not just charity, but he gave them full participation in a world that he was now in charge of. You see, God's shalom is like that. God's way of planning is about a way of planning and providing for all. We can only fully participate in God's planning when we rid ourselves of our own selfish ambitions and stop just letting things happen based on the existing oppressive momentums of the world. What does God's shalom look like? Well, first and foremost, God's planning is compassion. It is about caring for each other. It is about caring for the least of these. The reality is, if we're honest with ourselves, most of our kids will be okay. We have to learn more, to care more about the safety and well-being of other people's kids than we care about building just another jogging path or just another dog park in our neighborhoods. We have to learn to care just as much about the food deserts in urban areas as we care about our own access to organic and non-GMO ingredients to make in whatever recipe we found on Pinterest. Shalom planning is about compassion for others and caring for those whom God calls the least of these. But shalom planning is also about justice. We will never be able to undo years of oppression unless we step outside of the prisons that we have built for our own minds. Prisons that make us think it's okay to lock up everyone else so that we can feel safe. Prisons that make us accept that racial profiling is okay because it doesn't really affect our children. Shalom planning is about justice for all, and it's about changing our society in a way that values everyone. And finally, shalom planning is about equity. Equity in every facet of life. We have to learn that things that we take for granted are basic and fundamental needs that others don't have. Housing is a basic fundamental need that everybody should have. That is shalom planning. Water is a basic and fundamental need that everyone should have access to, and we should protect it from being exploited. That is shalom planning. Living wages are a basic and fundamental need for everybody, and we should insist that everyone make enough to live and to provide for their families. That is shalom planning. Shalom planning means leading with God's plans for providing for all of creation. It is true that the best laid plans of mice and humans often go awry because those plans are often based on our own selfishness and our own misguided hierarchies and privileges. But God's plan of shalom is compassion, it's justice, it's equity. It's a different kind of planning than we typically engage in. It is not enough to simply lift our brothers and our sisters out of the holes that they have fallen into. We have to learn to dismantle the systems that constantly land them there. Maybe it's time that we all become dreamers. Dreaming and creating a world of shalom. A world of peace where reconciliation and anti-racism are the norm rather than the exception. A world of compassion where the least of these are first in all of our planning. A world of justice where mass incarceration and racial profiling are ended and no one has a problem saying and demonstrating that Black Lives Matter. A world of equity where every human being experiences the fullness of life as God intended all of us to have. This, my sisters and my brothers, is God's dream for us. This is God's shalom planning. Amen.